It started with a decision most people wouldn't have made. Not in this economy, not with bills piling up, college tuition looming, and job security hanging by a thread. But Jack Hudson wasn't most people. That Tuesday morning, the sky cracked open over Valley Forge, rain slamming the cracked asphalt like a warning shot. By 9 a.m., the puddles in the Donovan's auto repair garage were wide enough to ripple when tools hit the ground, and the wind rattled the old metal doors like it was trying to force its way in. Jack was elbow deep in the engine of a Mercedes S-Class, the kind of car that never saw a dirt road and always came with a high-paying client attached. It was Paul Henderson's car, a city council member whose opinion mattered more than most, especially to Frank Donovan, the owner of the shop. Jack had been at Donovan's for 15 years. He knew every creak in the floor, every shortcut that saved time without sacrificing quality. He also knew Frank, knew the way his eyes narrowed when the rain came too hard, when deadlines came too close, and when the bills stacked too high. So when Diane, the office assistant, rushed in from the front with urgency in her voice, Jack already knew something was off. "Ambulance broke down," she said, breathless. "Highway 19, 2 miles east. Patient on board. Serious condition. Paramedic says the engine's dead." She looked straight at Frank, waiting for a direction. Frank didn't miss a beat. "Tell them to call county. We've got work." Jack stood slowly, hands still stained with grease, rain tapping the back of his neck from a leak in the ceiling. "What kind of ambulance?" he asked, almost absently. "Type 3 Ford. Fuel system issue, maybe a broken line," Diane replied. Jack looked at the Mercedes, then back at Diane, back at Frank. He could already feel the choice pulling at him. Frank's voice cut in sharp. "Don't even think about it. That's Henderson's car. He's picking it up by noon. You leave that now, you're done." Jack hesitated, his gaze fixed on the toolbox by his feet. "Someone's life is on that ambulance, Frank." "And that Mercedes pays our bills," Frank snapped. "We lose Henderson, we lose a month of payroll. You think he's going to wait while you play hero on the side of the road?" There was no room for compromise in Frank's voice. The rain grew louder, as if it were trying to drown out the tension between them. Every mechanic in the garage had stopped working. Even Kyle, the youngest, wide-eyed and silent, watched like he was witnessing something bigger than a job argument, like he was watching a man stand at the edge of something irreversible. Jack didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just wiped his hands on a rag, reached for his raincoat, and grabbed his tools. "I'll finish the Mercedes when I get back." "There won't be a when you get back," Frank called after him, but Jack was already out the door. The rain was relentless. By the time Jack reached his truck, he was soaked to the bone. The engine coughed twice before starting, windshield wipers screaming across the glass like they were trying to hold back the storm themselves. Highway 19 was a slick, winding mess, the kind of road you didn't want to be broken down on even in sunshine, let alone during a downpour that swallowed sound and sight both. But Jack knew these roads. He'd driven them more than anyone else. He'd pulled over to help more stranded drivers than he could count, patched more engines in the pouring rain than he could remember. This was his turf, even if nobody else thought it mattered. He spotted the ambulance 5 minutes later. Hazard lights blinking dimly, steam hissing from under the hood. The paramedic, Miguel, was waving him down before Jack even stopped. "Hudson," he shouted over the rain. "Man, am I glad to see you." Miguel didn't need to explain. Jack already had the hood up, already saw the cracked fuel line and the loose pump connection, already knew time was thin. "Got tape? Anything I can patch with?" he asked. Miguel sprinted to the back, returned with an emergency kit. Jack's hands moved fast but steady. There was no margin for hesitation. Rain ran down his face, into his eyes, onto the metal and rubber and wires he worked with like a surgeon under fire. "Start it," he called. The ambulance coughed, stalled, then roared to life. Miguel didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. The siren lit up and the ambulance tore down the highway like it was running from death itself. And Jack just stood there, drenched and motionless, watching the lights fade into the gray. He didn't know it yet, But the woman inside that ambulance wasn't just anyone. And what he'd just done hadn't just saved a life. It had changed his own forever. The storm didn't let up. If anything, the rain fell harder now, slashing sideways across the windshield as Jack drove back into town. His soaked clothes clung to his skin, the cold seeping through every layer, but he barely noticed. His mind was still with that ambulance, with the flashing lights disappearing into the mist, with the quiet urgency in Miguel's voice, and the kind of chaos that only settles in once a life hangs on a thread. Jack had patched enough engines in impossible conditions before, but this was different. This wasn't a flat tire or a dead battery on the side of the interstate. That ambulance was carrying someone's mother, sister, daughter, friend, and that temporary fix. It might have been the last thing keeping her alive. But Jack didn't stick around for praise or a handshake. There wasn't time, and besides, what was there to say? You do the right thing, or you don't, and when it was over you go home. Or in Jack's case, back to Donovan's. The garage was as he left it, dim, humming with the occasional buzz of fluorescent lights. The puddles on the floor had grown wider. Kyle was back under his car, and Carl, the senior mechanic, looked up from across the bay as Jack pulled into the lot. Frank was standing at the threshold with arms folded, posture stiff, like he'd been waiting the entire time just to pounce. Jack stepped out of his truck, toolbox in hand, clothes dripping, and walked toward the open bay like a man heading to a courtroom. Frank didn't wait. "You've got some nerve coming back here," he said flatly. Jack didn't answer. He kept walking, eyes on the Mercedes still sitting on the lift. The job wasn't finished. "I told you if you left, that was it," Frank snapped, stepping into Jack's path. "You're done." "I'll get Henderson's car done before noon. Won't be a problem," Jack said, brushing past, heading for his station. "You're not hearing me," Frank barked, his voice rising now. "You don't work here anymore." For a second, everything in the garage froze again. Kyle peeked out from under the Chevy. Carl straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. Diane stood in the office doorway, uncertain whether to step in. It was happening. Just like that. No meeting, no warning, no leniency. 15 years of loyalty, flushed in a matter of minutes. "I helped save a life, Frank," Jack said, quiet but firm. "You want to fire me for that? Fine. But don't pretend I didn't earn my place here." Frank's face was stone. "We're not in the life-saving business. We're in the paying customer business. You don't get to pick what matters more based on your gut." That was it. The cold finality of it hit like the rain outside. Jack didn't argue. He didn't plead. He walked to his locker, opened it, and began to gather his tools. Not the shop's tools, the personal ones. The ones he'd collected since he was a teenager. Wrenches with initials etched in the metal. A torque wrench gifted to him by his dad before boot camp. Each piece had its story. He didn't rush. If this was the end, he'd leave with dignity. Kyle walked over slowly. "This isn't right," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Jack gave him a small nod, a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Take care of that Chevy, all right? That rear caliper's about ready to seize." Carl came over next. "I'll make a call to Cooper's," he said quietly. "Might be some hours there, even if it's part-time." Jack shut his toolbox with a soft click. "Thanks, Carl." Then he walked past Frank without another word. No anger, no bitterness, just a quiet exit through the same door he'd walked through every morning for the last decade and a half. The rain hit his face like pins, and he loaded his gear into the passenger seat of his pickup. He sat there for a moment, both hands on the wheel, engine off, staring at the garage through the windshield. That place had been a second home, and now it was gone. Not for a mistake, not for failure, but for doing the right thing. That was the part that stung. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his son, Thomas. "Got my schedule for next semester. Looks packed, but I'm excited. Love you, Dad." Jack stared at the message, then let his head fall against the steering wheel. He hadn't told Thomas yet about the job, about the money, about how things were about to get harder than they already were. Jack's next move wasn't clear. Valley Forge wasn't exactly bustling with opportunities for middle-aged mechanics. Most of the other shops were already fully staffed, and Frank's reputation meant his words carried weight around town. One word from him, and doors could start closing before Jack even knocked. Still, none of that changed what he'd done that morning. Someone had needed help, and he helped. That part, the core of who Jack was, remained solid. The rain showed no signs of stopping, but for Jack it wasn't the weather that chilled him, it was the uncertainty, and the sinking realization that doing the right thing sometimes costs more than anyone warns you. The diner was warm, the kind of warmth that clings to your skin and smells like coffee grounds, frying bacon, and years of second chances. Jack Hudson stepped inside with the weight of the morning still soaked into his clothes, his boots leaving wet tracks across the black and white tile floor. He didn't even have to look around. He headed straight for the booth by the window. His booth, same one he'd been coming to for years, same cracked vinyl seat, same view of the grocery store parking lot across the street, currently a blur behind fogged-up glass. Helen Martinez was already on her way over with a coffee pot in hand, eyes narrowing the second she saw him. "You're not usually in here this time of day," she said, her voice that familiar blend of maternal concern and no-nonsense bluntness. She poured him a steaming cup without waiting for a reply, her gaze fixed on his face. "What happened?" Jack wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the heat crawl up into his fingers. "Got fired," he said finally, not bothering to soften the blow. "Frank didn't like me walking off the job." Helen raised an eyebrow. "That ambulance? That was you?" Jack nodded slowly, staring down into the swirling black coffee. "Fuel line had a crack. Quick fix, nothing fancy. Got it running. They made it to St. Mary's." Helen set the coffee pot on the table, slid into the seat across from him like this wasn't a short conversation. "And Frank fired you for that? For helping an ambulance?" Jack looked up, his face calm but his eyes distant. "Told me not to leave the Mercedes I was working on. Henderson's car. Said if I walked out, I shouldn't come back." Helen shook her head, a mix of disbelief and that hard-earned weariness that comes from seeing too many good people punished for the wrong reasons. 15 years you worked for that man, and he throws you out like yesterday's trash over a heartbeat. Jack didn't argue. What was there to say? It was done. The keys were turned in, the tools packed. His future, or whatever passed for one at his age in a town like Valley Forge, was a big empty slate. Helen leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You know who that patient was, don't you?" He looked at her blankly. "Didn't ask." "Elena Thompson," she said, letting the name hang there for a moment. "CEO of Meridian Motors. She collapsed during some big meeting at their satellite office downtown. Heart attack from what I heard. Ambulance broke down on the way to St. Mary's. If she hadn't gotten there when she did..." Jack blinked. He knew the name, of course. Everyone did. Meridian Motors wasn't just the biggest employer in the county, it was the employer. Their Westbrook City plant ran like a lifeline through the local economy. You couldn't go to a barbecue, town meeting, or grocery store without bumping into someone tied to the company in some way. Family, friend, neighbor, it didn't matter. If Meridian slowed down, the whole region felt it. And now he'd fixed the ambulance carrying its CEO without even knowing who she was. "I should probably go back," Jack said, more to himself than to Helen. "Make sure the temporary fix held, see if they need help finishing the repairs." Helen gave him a nod, her approval silent but firm. "That's you, Jack, always finishing the job." He pulled out a few bills and left them on the table, not waiting for change. As he stepped back into the still pouring rain, something had shifted. He didn't know what exactly, just that the fog in his mind had cleared a little. There wasn't a plan yet, no job waiting, no paycheck coming Friday, but there was something solid underneath all the uncertainty. He'd done the right thing, no matter what it cost, and right now, that was enough. By the time Jack pulled into the hospital parking lot, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, a grey mist hovering like breath over the pavement. He walked past rows of cars, up the slick concrete ramp and into the main lobby of St. Mary's. Inside, everything was quieter than he expected. No sirens, no crowds, just the low murmur of conversation and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum. At the front desk, he cleared his throat. "The ambulance that brought in Eleanor Thompson this morning. Do you know where it is?" The receptionist looked up, gave him a once-over, soaked work boots, oil-stained jeans, toolbox still in hand, and pointed down a hallway. "Emergency bay, out back. Maintenance is looking at it now." Jack nodded his thanks and followed the corridor through a set of heavy double doors. The emergency bay opened up like a stage behind the building, loading docks, flashing lights dimmed now, one lone ambulance parked under a flickering light. Miguel stood beside it, arms crossed, a deep frown creasing his forehead. A hospital tech hovered by the hood, scratching his head, clearly out of his depth. Miguel spotted Jack immediately. "Man, I was hoping you'd show up." Jack walked over, already rolling his sleeves up again. "Came to check the patch held. How's she doing?" "She made it," Miguel said, voice softer now. "Barely. Her heart stopped right as we pulled into the bay. They got it going again in the ER." Jack exhaled, not even realizing he'd been holding his breath. "But the rig's still not right," Miguel added. "Maintenance guys aren't used to working on ambulances. I figured, well, if you were around." Jack popped the hood and peered inside. The tape was still holding, just barely, but it was never meant to last long. "I can fix it right," he said, already pulling tools from his kit. Miguel stepped aside without a word, and Jack got to work. As his hands moved over the engine, reconnecting what had come loose, reinforcing the temporary fix with something real and lasting, he felt the calm that only came when he was under a hood. He didn't know it yet, but that second repair, just like the first, was being noticed. Not by hospital staff, not even by Miguel, but from behind a window 2 floors up, someone was watching. Someone who would soon call his name and change everything all over again. The air outside the hospital still carried the scent of wet pavement and diesel. Jack stood beside the ambulance, his hands streaked with grease, his jacket damp from the drizzle that refused to quit. The engine purred now, steady, clean. He stepped back, wiping his hands on a shop rag, watching Miguel close the hood and give it a firm pat, like it was a living thing they'd just brought back to life. "You're a lifesaver, Jack," Miguel said, and the words hit harder than Jack expected. Not because they were praise, Jack had never cared much for compliments, but because this time they might actually be true. He lingered a moment longer, glancing up at the hospital windows, not really sure what he was waiting for. Maybe a sign, maybe nothing. Then he turned and made his way back to his pickup, the reality of what came next finally starting to land. Frank's threat hadn't been idle. Jack knew that. Knew the second he'd stepped into the rain that morning, toolbox in hand, that he was walking out of one world without a clear path into another. But it didn't feel like regret. It felt like the cost of doing what needed to be done. Back at Donovan's, the garage lights were still on, spilling across the slick concrete like they always did. Jack pulled into the side lot, parked in his usual spot, even though he knew it wasn't his anymore. The heavy roll-up door groaned as he stepped inside, his boots echoing against the wet floor. Everyone looked up. Even the music had stopped. Kyle, Carl, Diane, they all stood still, eyes bouncing between him and Frank, who waited by the bay entrance like a foreman ready to swing the axe. Frank crossed his arms, his face unreadable. "I told you not to go," he said flatly. Jack set down his toolbox beside the Mercedes. "And I told you I'd get Henderson's car done. It's not even noon." "You're not listening," Frank said, stepping forward. "You're done here." Jack didn't move. 15 years, Frank." "And you threw it away," Frank snapped. "I gave you an order. That car was priority, not some busted ambulance. You chose, Jack. You chose them over this shop." "I chose a human life," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "That woman wouldn't have made it if I hadn't gone." "And that's not your decision to make," Frank barked. "You're not EMS. You're not a hero. You're a mechanic. My mechanic, or at least you were." Behind Frank, the others were still watching. Kyle looked like he wanted to say something but didn't. Carl's brow was tight, the kind of silent disapproval only a veteran mechanic could express. Diane stepped forward hesitantly, voice low. "Frank, maybe sleep on it. Jack's one of the best we've got." "No," Frank said without even glancing at her. "We set a precedent here, Diane. We lose everything. If Jack gets to decide which jobs matter and which don't, next thing you know, everyone's picking and choosing. We run a business, not a charity." Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. It wouldn't have made a difference. The decision had already been made. Without another word, he walked to his locker. Every step felt heavier, like he was wading through mud. He opened the metal door with a quiet creak, and inside was his world. Tools worn smooth from use, photographs of Thomas and Emma tucked between old invoices, a faded patch from his army unit pinned above a spare pair of gloves. One by one, he packed his tools into the battered red box, each click and clang a memory, a chapter of the life he was now being pushed out of. Kyle finally broke the silence. "This isn't right, Jack." Jack gave him a small smile. "It's all right, kid. You keep learning. That Chevy still needs those brakes looked at." Carl waited until Frank turned away before stepping closer. "Cooper's garage might be hiring. I'll make a call." "Thanks," Jack replied, voice low. The final latch of his toolbox clicked shut, sealing away 15 years. He lifted it carefully, walked back through the shop one last time, and stepped into the misty afternoon. The rain had slowed, just enough for the clouds to hang like a question mark over the town. He opened the passenger door of his truck and slid the toolbox onto the seat beside him. It sat there like a loyal dog, scratched and dented but dependable. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, engine off, hands on the wheel, just staring at the garage. It had been his second home, and now it was gone, not by his choice, but because he had made the kind of choice you don't walk back from. His phone buzzed. A text. Thomas. "Hey, Dad, just got my schedule for next semester. Full course load, but I think I can handle it." Jack closed his eyes. Tuition, rent, groceries, all of it. And now no paycheck. He took a deep breath and replied, "That's great, son. We'll talk about it tonight. Everything's fine." He couldn't bring himself to say anything more. Not yet. Maybe later. Right now, he needed space. Air. He turned the key. The old truck coughed twice and started. As he pulled away, he didn't look back. His first stop was the diner. Not for coffee this time, but because it was the only place where the silence didn't press against his chest. Helen poured him a second cup without a word. Eventually, she said, "You gonna tell him?" Jack nodded. "Tonight." She studied him for a moment. "You did the right thing, you know. That ambulance, it was carrying someone important." Jack lifted his eyes. "Elena Thompson." "Word gets around." He said nothing, just sipped the coffee, letting the heat take the edge off the chill in his bones. "Maybe she'll remember," Helen said after a long pause. "Maybe she'll do something about it." Jack shrugged. "Don't expect anything." Helen nodded slowly. "That's why you're different. You do the thing no one else will, and you don't stick around for the pat on the back." The rain outside had stopped, leaving only the sound of tires on wet roads and the low murmur of the diner's radio. Jack sat there, not just a man between jobs, but a man at a crossroads, carrying the weight of his choice and the uncertainty of what came next. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that his decision had already begun to ripple outward, past Frank, past the shop, past the hospital, and straight into the office of the most powerful woman in the region, who was even now asking a single pointed question: who was the mechanic who fixed that ambulance? Jack pulled into the hospital parking lot just after noon, the clouds overhead beginning to break, sending narrow rays of sunlight through the thinning cover as if the sky itself was taking a cautious breath. The blacktop still shimmered with rainwater, but for the first time all day it wasn't falling anymore. He eased his truck into a spot near the emergency bay, put it in park, and sat in silence for a moment. His fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel, a nervous rhythm that had nothing to do with waiting and everything to do with what he wasn't sure to expect. He hadn't been invited. No one had called. He just couldn't bring himself to leave things unfinished. He climbed out of the truck, toolbox in hand again, not for dramatic effect, just because it felt like armor, and made his way inside. The front desk receptionist greeted him with a professional half-smile until he explained he was looking for the ambulance that had come in that morning, the one with the mechanical issue. "That's probably in the emergency bay," she said, pointing. "Maintenance is checking it out now." Jack gave a short nod of thanks and followed the long corridor toward the side exit. The emergency bay was a flurry of movement. Orderlies wheeling gurneys, nurses returning carts, technicians scanning clipboards. And near the edge of the lot, there it was, the same Type 3 ambulance, its paint glinting with a fresh sheen of rain. The hood popped open like a mouth waiting for answers. Beside it stood Miguel, arms crossed, face lined with concern, as he watched a man in a hospital maintenance uniform, fiddling with a diagnostic scanner, clearly out of his depth. Miguel spotted Jack and broke into a look of pure relief. "Man, I was hoping you'd come back." Jack approached, already squinting under the raised hood. "Thought I'd check my patch job held." Miguel gestured helplessly toward the maintenance guy, who offered a half-hearted shrug. "It got us here," Miguel said, "but now the thing won't stay idling. Maintenance doesn't specialize in this kind of system." Jack leaned in without a word, already examining the electronic fuel pump again. His fingers worked automatically, peeling back the layers of plastic casing, rechecking the seals, retightening the clamps on the cracked fuel line. He could see what had gone wrong, what had always been wrong. This wasn't a one-time failure. The system had been overdue for a proper fix for months. The temp repair had held, but only just. The damage went deeper than a crack. It was in the connections themselves. Weak wiring, friction wear. No wonder the engine wouldn't idle. "Same problem?" Miguel asked. Jack nodded. "And then some. Needs more than a Band-Aid this time." Miguel stepped aside, and Jack dug into his toolbox. He'd brought the good stuff: heat shrink tubing, sealant, replacement clips, even a spare relay switch. In another life, he might have charged a service call for this. But today, it wasn't about the hours or the rate. It was about finishing what he'd started. He replaced the faulty connections, sealed the line properly, installed a sturdier clamp system, and reinforced the electrical routing with spare wire loom. Everything was done carefully, methodically, the way he'd been trained back in the army, because even a half-second delay in a combat zone could mean the difference between extraction and disaster. He wasn't overseas anymore, but the stakes still felt high. "Try it," Jack called once everything was in place. Miguel climbed into the cab and turned the key. The engine coughed once, then roared to life, this time steady and strong, the rhythmic hum like a heartbeat restored. Jack wiped his hands on a rag. "You're good now. No more breakdowns unless someone ignores the next 3 service warnings." "You're a damn wizard," Miguel muttered, stepping out of the cab and shaking Jack's hand. Seriously, that woman inside, her heart stopped as we pulled into the bay. If we'd been 5 minutes later. Jack didn't reply. He just gave a faint nod. He didn't like thinking about the what-ifs. "You want to come inside?" Miguel offered. "I'm sure Dr. Miller would want to thank you herself." Jack hesitated. "I'm not looking for thanks." "Well, someone's already been asking for you," Miguel said, lowering his voice. "Apparently, the woman you saved is a pretty big deal." Jack raised an eyebrow. "She's the CEO of Meridian Motors," Miguel said quietly. "Name's Elena Thompson. Recognized her from the local business news. Her people have been showing up all morning. Suits, security, all sorts of top brass." Jack blinked, processing that. "I didn't know. I just saw an ambulance on the side of the road." "Exactly," Miguel said. "That's the difference between you and most people." Jack didn't say anything, just stood there a moment longer, staring at the now running ambulance. The hum of the engine echoed faintly in his bones. He felt something inside him settle. It was done. The repair was solid. The patient was safe. The job, whatever you wanted to call it, was finished. But he also knew something else now. He hadn't just fixed a machine. He'd thrown a stone into still water, and the ripples were already moving in directions he hadn't predicted. "Thanks for everything, Jack," Miguel said, patting him on the shoulder. Jack turned, toolbox in hand again, and made his way back through the halls, past doctors and nurses, past the worried families and the blinking monitors and the antiseptic smell that never quite left a hospital. In the waiting room, he sat for a few minutes, unsure why he lingered. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he wasn't ready to face the fact that he was still jobless. Maybe part of him hoped he could catch a glimpse of the woman whose life he'd helped save. He wasn't expecting a parade, just maybe some kind of closure. But what he didn't know, sitting in that hard vinyl chair, was that Elena Thompson was already making calls from her hospital bed. That behind a locked door on the ICU floor, her voice was calm but insistent, asking her assistant to track down a man named Jack Hudson, that she was already making arrangements to meet him, because Elena wasn't just any patient, and Jack hadn't just fixed an ambulance. He'd changed the course of both their lives, and in less than 24 hours he'd find out just how far that ripple would go. Jack returned to Donovan's auto repair later that afternoon, soaked to the bone despite the brief reprieve in the rain. The streets had started to steam under the warming sun, but his clothes clung to him with the uncomfortable chill that comes from a day spent running against the current. He pulled into the lot with a quiet sense of finality, already anticipating the confrontation he knew was waiting. The garage bay was open, and Frank stood just inside, arms crossed like a bouncer at a door Jack no longer had the right to enter. There was no dramatic pause, no shared understanding between old co-workers, just the sharp, cold look of a man determined to prove a point. "I told you not to go," Frank said, his voice devoid of emotion. Jack walked past him without a word and headed straight for the half-repaired Mercedes he'd been working on that morning. He wanted to finish what he started. At the very least, he owed that to himself. But Frank stepped in front of him, planting himself like a concrete wall. "No, you won't. I meant what I said. You're fired." The words struck with a blunt force that made Jack's stomach twist. Around them, the garage grew still. Kyle, the young apprentice, had frozen mid-turn with a wrench in hand. Carl, the oldest mechanic in the shop besides Jack, leaned against his tool chest with a look that wavered between frustration and disbelief. The air was thick with the kind of silence that only comes when something irreversible has just happened. "Frank, come on," Carl finally said, stepping forward. "Jack's been here 15 years. He didn't steal from you. He didn't wreck a customer's car. He helped save someone's life." Frank didn't flinch. He disobeyed a direct order. You know what happens when you let that slide? Everyone starts making their own decisions about which jobs matter and which don't. Next time, it's Kyle walking off mid-repair because he thinks a tow truck call is more important. Jack kept his tone measured, though his pulse was pounding in his ears. That ambulance had a critical patient. The other unit was 20 minutes away. She might not have had 20 minutes. "You don't make that call," Frank snapped. "Not on my time. Not with my customers waiting." Jack looked past Frank toward the Mercedes. The hood was still open, the tools still where he'd left them. It wouldn't take him an hour to finish, but the job wasn't really the point anymore. "Give me 1 hour," he said. "I'll finish Henderson's car, and then I'll go." "No," Frank replied, stepping aside and pointing toward the lockers. "Get your things and leave." Diane, Frank's assistant, emerged from the office, having overheard enough to know exactly what was unfolding. "Frank, reconsider," she urged. "You know Jack's our best mechanic." "He disobeyed me," Frank replied with finality. "This shop runs on discipline and priorities. You want to throw that away because of a good deed? Go start a charity, not a business." Jack stood for a long moment, absorbing the reality of it all. He'd given everything to this place, his time, his sweat, his pride. He'd worked through holidays, covered shifts, mentored the younger mechanics, stayed late more times than he could count. And now it was over. Because he'd chosen a life over a car, a person over a profit margin. He walked back to his locker with the slow, deliberate pace of someone collecting pieces of a life being torn down. Inside, his personal tools sat in their usual places. Sockets arranged by size, ratchets worn smooth from use, pliers whose grips had molded to his hands over the years. He packed them carefully, each one a reminder of a repair done, a job completed, a customer satisfied. The smell of oil and rubber in the garage clung to everything. It was familiar, grounding, and now it was slipping away. Kyle approached awkwardly as Jack snapped the lid shut. "This isn't right," he said, almost in a whisper. "You did the right thing." Jack gave him a faint smile. "Take care of that Chevy, kid. Brakes were squealing. You'll want to check the calipers." Carl waited near the door, arms folded, concern etched deep in his lined face. "You'll land on your feet, Jack. There are other garages in town. I'll put in a word with Steve over at Cooper's." Jack nodded, grateful. "Appreciate it, Carl." As he carried the heavy toolbox to his truck, he noticed that the rain had completely stopped. The sky above Valley Forge was clearing, light peeking through, glinting off puddles like scattered bits of glass. He placed the toolbox in the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel, his fingers trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the uncertainty. 15 years, gone in the span of a morning. And for what? A decision he'd still make again in a heartbeat. His phone rang. He didn't look at the screen before answering, just hoped it wasn't another bill collector. "Hey, Dad," came his son's voice, upbeat and full of the kind of youthful energy Jack envied on days like this. "Just got my schedule for next semester. Full course load, but I think I can handle it." Jack gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at the garage he no longer belonged to. "That's great, son," he managed, keeping his voice steady. "We'll talk about it tonight, okay?" "You all right? You sound off." "Just a rough morning," Jack said. "Nothing to worry about." But as he hung up the phone, the truth pressed down on him like the humid air after a storm. College tuition was already straining their budget to the breaking point. Without a job, it would become an avalanche. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to regret what he'd done. Some things didn't fit into a balance sheet. Some actions weren't meant to be measured by the paycheck they cost. He started the engine, the familiar rumble of his old pickup reminding him that not everything in his life was unraveling. There was still motion, still momentum. And somewhere down the road, another beginning might be waiting, if he could just make it far enough without breaking. The engine of Jack's old pickup ticked softly as it cooled in the parking lot of the Crossroads Diner, a place that had seen him through more than a few long days and late nights. The sky had begun to shift, the thick gray clouds that had hung heavy over Valley Forge finally parting, letting through streaks of golden sunlight that reflected off the puddles lining the sidewalk. Jack sat in his truck for a moment, staring through the windshield as the faint wisp of steam rose from the hood. It had been one of the longest mornings of his life, yet something deeper than exhaustion kept him from turning the key and driving off. He wasn't ready to go home, not yet. There was something unfinished lingering in the air, as if the day had more to tell him. Inside the diner, the bell over the door chimed as he stepped through, the familiar scent of brewed coffee and frying bacon wrapping around him like a blanket. The place was quiet, as it always was this time of day, with just a handful of regulars scattered across booths and stools. Jack made his way to his usual spot, third booth from the window, where the sun hit just right when it broke through the clouds, and slid into the worn leather seat with a tired groan. Helen Martinez, who'd been serving coffee and wisdom from behind the counter since before Jack moved to Valley Forge, was already approaching with a pot in hand. "You're not usually here this time of day," she remarked, eyeing him curiously as she poured the dark liquid into his mug. "Things change," Jack muttered, wrapping his fingers around the cup, more for the warmth than the caffeine. Helen tilted her head, studying him. "What happened?" He sighed, the words heavy on his tongue. "I got fired." Helen blinked, surprised. "What? From Donovan's? What for?" Jack hesitated, then shrugged. "Helped an ambulance that broke down on Highway 23. Frank didn't like that I walked away from a job to do it." Helen lowered the pot slowly, as if making sense of his words one at a time. "Frank fired you for helping save someone's life?" "His rules," Jack said. "Cars first, people later." Helen shook her head with disbelief, muttering something under her breath about Frank always having more grease than soul. She refilled a sugar caddy at the table next to him, but kept one eye on him. "That ambulance, was it the one that just took Elelanina Thompson to St. Mary's?" Jack looked up, puzzled. "Don't know who it was. Just knew they needed to move fast. Woman in the back, paramedic said heart attack." "Well," Helen said, lowering her voice, "word travels fast in this town. That woman was Elelanina Thompson, Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Motors. Collapsed during a meeting at their satellite office. They say she nearly died." Jack sat back, absorbing that like a punch to the chest. Meridian Motors wasn't just some company. It was the company around here. Half the county depended on it for jobs. Their facility over in Westbrook was the beating heart of the local economy. Elelanina Thompson was more than a CEO. She was practically royalty in Valley Forge. "They said the ambulance broke down on the way," Helen continued. "If they'd been delayed much longer." Her words trailed off, but Jack heard what she wasn't saying. If he hadn't gone. He stared into his coffee, the steam rising in slow swirls. He hadn't known. He didn't ask names, didn't care who the patient was. He just saw a vehicle in distress, a man asking for help, and someone in the back who might not make it unless something changed fast. He did what needed doing, simple as that. Only now, the weight of the moment hit different. The decision he made might have saved the life of one of the most influential people in the state, maybe even the country. "I should check on the ambulance," Jack said quietly, rising from his seat and tossing a few bills onto the table for the coffee. "Make sure the temporary fix held up." Helen nodded approvingly, a rare softness in her voice. "That's you all over, Jack. Always finishing the job." The hospital wasn't far. Jack's truck growled reluctantly to life and rolled through the still wet streets of Valley Forge. The sun had finally claimed the day, and the road glistened beneath his tires as he headed towards St. Mary's. He parked around the side, near the ambulance bay, where he found Miguel Rodriguez pacing near the rear of the same ambulance he'd repaired that morning. "Jack!" Miguel called out, relief all over his face. "Man, I was hoping you'd show up." "Thought I'd make sure the patch held," Jack replied, striding over and examining the back of the rig. Miguel gestured to the open hood, where a hospital maintenance worker stood scratching his head. "It got us to the hospital, but it's not right. Maintenance says they're not trained for this kind of engine work. I was just thinking, I wish Jack Hudson would walk through that door, and here you are." Jack leaned over the engine, checking the line he'd spliced earlier. The duct tape had held, but barely. The fuel connection was too unstable to trust for another run. "I can fix it properly if you want," Jack said, already rolling up his sleeves. Miguel stepped aside. "Be my guest." As Jack got to work, his hands found purpose again, moving with the comfort of familiarity. Miguel watched him work in silence, then finally said, "That woman in the back?" "Elelanina Thompson." Her heart stopped right as we got into the bay. Another 5 minutes and... He let the thought drift. Jack didn't reply, focusing instead on tightening a clamp. He didn't want to think about what might have happened, didn't want to feel like a hero. That kind of thinking got people sloppy. He wasn't there for recognition. He was there because things needed doing. "She going to be okay?" he asked. Miguel nodded. "Critical but stable. ICU. They've got the best on her." Jack finished the repair and wiped his hands on a rag. "Start it up." Miguel turned the key. The engine purred like it should have that morning. "Perfect," Miguel said. "We owe you." Jack shook his head. "Just doing what needed doing." As Miguel was called away for another incoming call, Jack found himself alone again, the weight of the morning slowly folding in on him. He sat on a nearby bench near the ambulance bay, the sounds of the hospital alive around him, voices, stretchers, monitors beeping behind walls he couldn't see. He looked down at his hands, the creases still dark with oil, the knuckles cracked and calloused, tools of his trade, proof of the life he'd built. But now everything had changed, and he wasn't sure where any of it was leading. Still, if he had to do it over again, he would have made the same choice. No question, even if it cost him everything. It started with a knock on the door that Jack almost didn't answer. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, the same seat he'd occupied for what felt like hours, lost in the quiet churn of thought that follows a day where the ground shifts under your feet. The tools he'd brought home from Donovan's still sat in the hallway, untouched. His phone had gone quiet. Even the hum of the fridge felt louder than usual, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every creak in the floor, every ticking second. The knock came again, firmer this time, a polite insistence that didn't belong to a bill collector or a neighbor with idle gossip. Jack stood up slowly, unsure what he expected, and when he opened the door, he found a man in a charcoal suit with a lapel pin that gleamed subtly in the evening light. Not a uniform, not quite a businessman, something in between, the kind of presence that commands attention without raising its voice. "Jack Hudson?" the man asked, holding out a card. "My name's Robert Langley. I work with Meridian Motors. I was wondering if I could have a few minutes of your time." Jack's brow furrowed, suspicious. Meridian Motors wasn't exactly the kind of company that made house calls, especially not to unemployed mechanics living in modest houses on the edge of town. Still, something in Langley's tone suggested it wasn't a sales pitch. He nodded once and stepped aside. Inside, Langley didn't sit until Jack offered the chair across from him. The man's eyes scanned the room, not in judgment, but as if cataloging every detail for relevance. He placed a small folder on the table, neatly organized, professional to a fault. "We understand you were involved in assisting an ambulance yesterday on Route 23, Langley said. "Specifically, the unit transporting Ella Lanena Thompson to St. Mary's." Jack gave a small nod, unsure where this was going. "I got their rig running long enough to get her to the hospital. They were dead in the water, no time to wait for backup." Langley opened the folder. "We've spoken with the paramedics, reviewed the logs. You made a quick field repair using limited tools under pressure and likely saved Miss Thompson's life in the process." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what needed doing." Langley looked up, holding his gaze. "That's exactly what makes it remarkable." There was a pause, measured, deliberate, before Langley continued. "Ms. Thompson is recovering well. She's already asking about the mechanic who refused to walk away. The board at Meridian has discussed this extensively. Valley Forge is our home turf. We're proud of our people. We don't believe that kind of initiative should go unrewarded." Jack tilted his head, wary. "What are you getting at?" Langley smiled faintly and slid a document across the table. "We'd like to offer you a position, lead fleet maintenance supervisor at our Westbrook plant. Full benefits, competitive salary, relocation assistance if needed. You'd oversee the maintenance of over 60 company vehicles and emergency support units." Jack stared at the offer, stunned. The words blurred slightly as he took them in. A salary nearly double what he earned at Donovan's. Health coverage that could actually handle his son's tuition and his wife's old medical debt. Paid vacation, stability, recognition. Everything Frank had refused to see in him laid out in crisp font on company letterhead. "I don't know what to say," Jack muttered, still trying to process the moment. Langley gave him a moment, then added, "Ms. Thompson is a firm believer in rewarding character. She wanted to meet you personally, but, well, she's still recovering, but I believe you'll hear from her soon." Jack sat back in his chair. He thought of the years spent under fluorescent lights in a grease-stained garage, the loyalty he'd given freely, even when it cost him, the second-guessing of whether integrity had a place in the modern world. And here, from the most unexpected place, came validation, not just in words, but in action. "What's the catch?" he asked finally, a reflex born of too many disappointments. "No catch," Langley said. "Just someone who noticed when you did the right thing." For a moment, Jack didn't say anything. He thought of his wife, of their long conversations about holding on just a little longer. He thought of his son's voice on the phone, so full of hope and ambition. He thought of Carl, of Helen, of the paramedics, of all the quiet nods of respect that had carried him through hard days. This offer wasn't just about a job, it was about being seen, being valued. He reached out, picked up the pen Langley had left with the folder, and turned it over in his fingers. There was still hesitation in his chest, not because he doubted the opportunity, but because part of him hadn't quite let go of the old life yet. That garage had been his world for so long, even if it had stopped appreciating him years ago. But maybe it was time. Time to stop waiting for the world to reward quiet loyalty. Time to start building something new. "I need a day to think," Jack said. Langley nodded respectfully. "Take two. Call me when you're ready. We'd be lucky to have you, Mr. Hudson." As the door closed behind him, Jack sat back at the table, staring at the offer. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. Outside, a breeze stirred the trees gently, the kind of early evening calm that reminded him of childhood summers and simpler times. He didn't feel triumphant, not yet, but something inside him had shifted. Hope wasn't just a concept now, it was a choice. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to make one. Jack arrived 15 minutes early, but even then, the lobby of St. Mary's already hummed with quiet urgency. The soft murmur of nurses beginning their shifts, the steady roll of gurneys down polished floors, and the distant beeping of machines formed a kind of low-frequency symphony of healing. He stood for a moment at the entrance, holding his breath, not quite ready to walk up to the desk. The building hadn't changed since he last stood there, but he had. Gone were the oil-stained overalls and the slight stoop of a man who spent years beneath hoods and under chassis. Today, he wore the same carefully pressed shirt he'd put on the day after his firing. A pale blue one Emma had once said brought out the calm in his eyes. It felt right somehow that he'd wear it again now, returning to the place where everything had started to shift. At the reception desk, he gave his name. The woman on duty smiled in a way that was just a bit warmer than professional courtesy. She made a quick phone call, nodded, then told him someone would be down shortly. Jack found himself guided to the same vinyl chair he'd sat in days ago, back when he was just another out-of-work mechanic clinging to a thread of pride. It was strange how different it all felt now. The chair hadn't changed, but he had. This time, he wasn't waiting for answers. He was part of one. 5 minutes later, a woman in her 40s approached him, her presence brisk and polished. "Mr. Hudson, I'm Rebecca Winters, head of HR at Meridian Motors. Mrs. Thompson is expecting you." She extended a hand with practiced confidence, and Jack rose to shake it, suddenly aware of the calluses on his fingers and the decades of physical labor etched into his skin. But if she noticed, she gave no sign. "Right this way." They walked in silence through the wide corridors of the hospital, past family members whispering hopeful prayers, nurses juggling charts and beeping IVs, and doctors conferring in hushed tones. It reminded Jack that not everyone who came through these halls left the way they entered. He didn't know what Elelena Thompson wanted from him, not really. Gratitude, maybe. A handshake and a thank you. But even that felt foreign. No CEO he knew took the time to meet the person who turned a wrench when an ambulance broke down. Then again, nothing about this woman had followed the rules Jack expected. They took the elevator up to the 4th floor, private suites, where money softened the edges of suffering. The air was cooler, quieter. The walls were adorned with soft art and tasteful lighting. 2 men in dark suits stood outside the last door on the hall, their expressions unreadable as they stepped aside at Rebecca's nod. Inside, sunlight poured through tall windows, filtered by linen curtains that danced in the soft breeze from a cracked open window. Flowers lined every surface, roses, lilies, orchids. It didn't smell like a hospital room, it smelled like a garden. In the middle of it all, propped up against crisp white pillows, sat Elelanina Thompson. Even in a hospital gown, she looked composed, sharp. Her silver hair was tied back, her eyes alert and piercing. "Mr. Hudson," she said, her voice strong despite the toll her body had clearly taken. "Please, come in." Jack entered slowly, unsure of the right way to approach a woman whose life he had saved without even knowing who she was. "Ma'am," he said simply. Rebecca stepped out, closing the door softly behind her, leaving them in silence. Elelanina gestured to a chair beside her bed. Jack took it, settling in with the caution of someone unsure if they belonged. "I've wanted to meet you," she said, "since the moment I was told what happened on Route 23. "I didn't do anything special," Jack began, already slipping into the old rhythm of modesty that had protected him from praise his entire life. She raised a hand to stop him. "Don't diminish it. You stopped. You acted. You got that ambulance running when no one else could. That wasn't just a repair. That was a decision. One most people wouldn't make under threat of losing their job. But you did." Jack swallowed, not out of nerves, but because it was hard to find the words when someone stripped away the excuses and left only the truth. "I didn't know who was in the back," he said finally. "Didn't matter. It was someone who needed help." She smiled faintly. "That's what makes it matter even more." There was a long pause, filled only by the rustling of flowers in the breeze and the faint sounds of the hospital hallway beyond the thick door. "I've built a career," she continued, "on numbers and projections, bottom lines and forecasts. But every so often, something reminds me that companies aren't built by spreadsheets. They're built by people. And you, Mr. Hudson, reminded me of that." Jack's eyes stayed locked on hers. He could see it then, the weight she carried, not just as a patient, but as a woman responsible for thousands of jobs, millions of dollars, and the public trust of an entire industry. "I want to offer you something," she said. "Not charity, not a thank you card or a ceremonial plaque. I want to offer you a job, a real one, with real responsibility, one that uses your instincts, your experience, your values. We're building a new division at Meridian, focused on vehicle integrity, real-world performance, and safety. We need someone who knows what it means to hold a broken system in your hands and fix it without excuses. We need you." Jack blinked. "Why me?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Because you didn't wait for permission to do the right thing, and I want that kind of thinking at the core of what we build next." He didn't respond right away. There were too many thoughts pushing each other out of the way in his mind. Fear, disbelief, hope, memory. He thought of Thomas and tuition. He thought of Emma and the dreams they once whispered in the dark when the world felt far more forgiving. He thought of Frank, of how quickly loyalty could be dismissed when it no longer served a ledger. "I've never worked in an office," he admitted. "I don't know the lingo, the politics." "Good," she said. "That's exactly what we need less of." The silence that followed didn't demand anything from him. She gave him space, the kind of space people rarely offer anymore. When Jack finally spoke, it wasn't a yes or a no. It was something more honest. "I'll think about it." "That's all I ask," she replied. As he stood to leave, she extended her hand. He took it, surprised by how firm her grip was. In that one gesture, Jack felt something shift inside him. Not ego, not pride, but a spark of belief that maybe, just maybe, everything that had happened had led to this for a reason. Outside, Rebecca was waiting, and a car was ready to take him home. But Jack paused at the door, looking back one last time at the woman in the bed surrounded by flowers, whose heart had nearly given out, and whose gratitude might just change the course of his life. As he walked down the corridor toward the elevator, The weight on his shoulders didn't feel so heavy anymore. For the first time in a long time, Jack Hudson didn't feel like a man picking up the pieces. He felt like a man about to build something entirely new. Jack spent most of the night wide awake. The Meridian Motors folder lay open on the kitchen table, its pages carefully fanned out like the pieces of some impossible puzzle. Salary breakdowns, benefit structures, projected responsibilities, all of it real, all of it waiting for a signature. The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak from the old pipes were the only sounds in the apartment. He stared at the paperwork, a mug of now cold coffee sitting beside it, untouched since he'd poured it 2 hours ago. Everything had changed so fast. 1 minute, he was tightening bolts under fluorescent lights in a leaky garage, and the next, he was sitting across from the CEO of one of the largest auto manufacturers in the country, listening to her offer him a job most men in his shoes would never even dream of. It felt too big, too sudden. He kept waiting for someone to knock on the door and tell him there'd been a mistake. By morning, his decision was still not fully formed, but something in his gut pushed him forward. He thought of Thomas, of the way his son had looked at him the night before, eyes lit with something between awe and pride, and that memory alone made the choice clearer. Jack dialed the number on Rebecca Winter's business card. She answered on the second ring, her tone as crisp and focused as before. "This is Rebecca." "Jack Hudson here," he said. "I'd like to accept the offer." There was a pause, brief but meaningful. "I'll make the arrangements," she replied. "Your onboarding documents will be emailed within the hour. First day is Monday. We're looking forward to having you on board." Jack set the phone down and exhaled, not realizing he'd been holding his breath. It was done. He was in. That weekend was a blur of preparation. He borrowed a friend's car to drive out to the nearest department store and bought 2 new shirts, a pair of slacks, and shoes that didn't have a single oil stain on them. He tried them on in the fitting room with the awkwardness of someone trying on someone else's life. The collar itched, the shoes felt stiff, but the man in the mirror didn't look completely out of place. Not anymore. He even took the time to give his truck a full cleaning inside and out, even though Rebecca had confirmed a company car would be available to him if he needed it. Jack declined. That truck had seen him through too much. If he was going to step into a new world, he'd do it from behind a familiar wheel. When Monday came, Jack woke before sunrise. The apartment was still and quiet, Thomas already gone for an early class. On the kitchen table, Jack found a folded note written in his son's neat handwriting. "Good luck, Dad. Show him what real skill looks like." Jack arrived at the Meridian Motors campus 30 minutes early. The building was massive. Steel and glass stretched wide across the landscape like a monument to modern industry. As he pulled into the employee lot, he saw his own reflection in the mirrored windows. The truck looked like a relic among a fleet of sleek electric sedans and hybrids, but Jack didn't feel ashamed. He'd gotten here on his own terms. Inside, he was met by Rebecca, who handed him his temporary badge and led him through a maze of polished hallways. The ceilings were high, the lighting soft, and everything smelled faintly of clean carpets and fresh paper. People moved with purpose, eyes fixed on tablets and laptops, conversations held in tones that mixed urgency with control. Jack felt like he had wandered onto the bridge of a spaceship. They stopped at the entrance of a department labeled Special Projects. Rebecca introduced him to David Taylor, a man in his 30s with sharp eyes and the posture of someone who lived in spreadsheets. David welcomed him, if a bit formally, and gave a tour of the department. Engineers buzzed around screens filled with complex simulations, technical drawings, and crash test data. Jack kept quiet, absorbing it all, but his mind couldn't help but focus on the machines. Not the numbers, not the theories, but the hardware, the stress points, the material flaws invisible to a computer model, but obvious to a mechanic who had seen what failure looked like in the real world. After a long morning of paperwork, orientation videos, and back-to-back introductions, Jack was finally shown to his workstation, a sleek desk with a monitor too wide to be practical, and a chair that adjusted in about 10 different directions. but Jack's eyes were drawn to the garage bay on the far end of the building, where a partially disassembled prototype of Meridian's next-generation vehicle sat like a patient on an operating table. It called to him, not just because it was a car, but because it was broken. That, at least, was something he understood. David joined him and gestured toward the prototype. That's the SX, our future flagship, state-of-the-art in every way, but there's a hiccup with its side-impact performance. Simulation results don't match real-world tests. We haven't been able to pin down why. Jack nodded. He didn't pretend to understand the data, but he did know how metal bends, how materials react under pressure, and what happens when theory meets reality in the worst way possible. He asked if he could get under the vehicle. David, surprised, gave a cautious yes. Jack lay down on a rolling creeper, scooted beneath the vehicle, and stared up at the chassis. His hands instinctively ran along the frame, the joints, the welds. And there it was, a design flaw so subtle no machine could flag it, but one that could split milliseconds too early in a crash. He emerged, covered in dust and grease smudges on his new shirt, and described what he saw. David blinked. We've been looking at that design for 6 months. Sometimes you have to feel the failure, Jack said, not just model it. Word spread fast. By the end of the day, Jack's observation had made its way up the ladder. Engineers who had politely nodded at him that morning now lingered around his desk, asking for his thoughts. A few still seemed skeptical, but most were intrigued. Jack didn't gloat. He just kept his head down and kept solving problems the way he always had, with focus, patience, and honesty. That evening, when he got home, Thomas was already there, his laptop open and college books scattered across the kitchen table. "How was it?" he asked. Jack smiled. "Not what I expected, but I didn't break anything." Thomas grinned. "Yet." They shared a laugh, and as they sat down for a late dinner of reheated leftovers, Jack realized something he hadn't felt in months, maybe years: purpose. He was still a mechanic at heart, still a man who fixed things. Only now, the things he was fixing had the power to save lives, influence a company's future, maybe even shape the entire industry. All of it, every conversation, every breakthrough, every new challenge was still ahead. But as the sun dipped below the skyline outside their apartment window, Jack Hudson knew one thing for sure. He was exactly where he needed to be.